Shalom Havarim, James Trim here. Sometimes when I start talking to people about the Hebrew and Aramaic origin of the so-called New Testament, I like to call it the Ketuvim Netzarim, the writings of the Nazarenes. But whenever I start talking about that, frequently, especially from Gentile Christians, I will hear the objection that surely Luke, the Gentile writer Luke, the Greek Gentile physician Luke would have written in Greek. Besides, he wrote to a guy that was clearly a Greek with a Greek name, Theophilus, right? Well, we're going to answer that and turn it on its head and show how most of that is not true and the rest of it's a distortion. But before we get started, I need to ask people to please donate to support this work, these videos, the blogs, and all the work that we are doing. We need your financial support. We can't do it without you. So please donate, and you can do that by clicking on the donate link in the video description or sending donations by PayPal to donations@wnae.org. We need your support, especially this month. April tends to be a bad month for us because here in the United States, at least, it's tax time. And a lot of people that might donate are putting a little extra money out, paying their taxes this month. So unfortunately, our needs don't change, and we need your support this month especially. All right, I'd like to ask everybody to please like this video, subscribe to this channel, click that little notification bell so that you'll get notifications when new videos come out. Let us know what you think of our videos in the comments, and participate in the discussions in the comments section. And all of these are things that the YouTube algorithm looks at to decide which videos to recommend to new users, and we want to be recommended to new users. By the way, we have an amazing like to view ratio compared to other videos on YouTube. So it's often in the neighborhood of 10% or not far off of 10%, and that is just unheard of. So we are really excited that people like the videos that we are putting out. All right. Also, please share the videos on your social media, on Facebook and Twitter and other social media in which you participate. Share it with your friends, okay? All right, with all that said, let's get going here. As frequently is the case, we have handouts that you can follow along with, and there's a link to the PDF file for the handouts in the video description. And the first handout is titled Greek Luke, a Translation. And it's really just a short quote. It's a quote from a guy named Charles Cutler Tory. I believe Dr. Charles Cutler Tory was in fact a professor at Yale, if I recall, and he wrote a very interesting book back in 1936 titled Our Translated Gospels. And the point of this book, the case that he was making in this book, was that our four Gospels were originally written in Aramaic and translated into Greek. And he examines this guy was an absolute expert on Semitic languages, and he examines the Greek of the so-called New Testament, and he observes from it that the Greek has an underlying Aramaic that's behind it. Now, he was making the case that it's an underlying Aramaic, but as I'd like to say, Aramaic and Hebrew are cognate languages. Seeing Aramaic behind Greek is almost the same as seeing Hebrew behind Greek. It's hard to distinguish the two because Hebrew and Aramaic are very similar languages. that share many of the same verbal roots, much of the same grammar, and in fact, Aramaic can be, and in Jewish circles is, written in Hebrew letters because they both use the same 22-letter alphabet. All right, so in his book, Charles Cutler Tory, in the introductory material on page LIX, I think that's 49, doing the Roman numerals in my head real quick. I'm not real great with Roman numerals. He writes, in regard to Luke, so he singles out Luke. The book is about all four of the Gospels. And in the book, he makes the case for all four Gospels as a group, that they were originally written by examining problems in the Greek text, that they were originally written in Aramaic. He writes, in regards to Luke, it remains to be said that of all the four Gospels, it is the one which gives by far the plainest and most constant evidence of being a translation. Now, the reason I'm bringing up Luke, and the reason he singled out Luke, I think is clear. Many people will say, well, surely the Gentile Greek Dr. Luke wrote, the physician, wrote in Greek to a Greek man, Theophilus, right? Well, as I said, we're going to show that that's completely not true. First of all, who was Luke? Luke wrote the book of Acts, the book of Luke, and the book of Acts, which is sort of a second Luke, frankly, and both are addressed to a guy named Theophilus, which we will talk about in a minute. And Luke is otherwise mentioned only 3 times in the New Testament by Paul, and all 3 times are just passing mentions as he closes letters that Luke is with him. And only one of those instances does Paul say anything more than his name. And in that instance, Paul refers to Luke as the beloved physician. Now, it is from this, primarily, that we have grown up a Christian tradition out of nowhere that Luke was a Gentile, that he was a Greek, because, of course, he was educated, right? He was a physician, a highly educated man, so he had to be a Gentile, because he couldn't possibly be Jewish if he was a highly educated physician. Now, was he a proselyte? There is a possibility that he was a proselyte. We're going to look at our next handout titled, Who Was Luke? And Eusebius, in his Ecclesiastical History, Book 3, Chapter 4, writes this concerning Luke. He says, Luke, who was born at Antioch, and by profession a physician, being for the most part connected with Paul, and familiarly acquainted with the rest of the apostles, has left us 2 inspired books. The institutes of that spiritual art which he obtained from them. One of these is his gospel, in which he testifies that he has recorded as those who were from the beginning eyewitnesses and ministers of the word, delivered to him, whom also he says he has in all things followed. The other is his Acts of the Apostles, which he composed, not from what he had heard from others, but from what he had seen himself. Now, there's a couple of interesting things here. One is that calling him a physician or a healer, okay, he says that he, quote, refers to that spiritual art which he obtained from them, implying that Luke was a healer in the spiritual sense, and that he had the gift of healing, not necessarily that he was a physician. Although in the sense that we might think of. There's no difference in ancient biblical Hebrew, Aramaic, and I don't even think Greek between physician and healer. Okay. However, that being said, even if you were a physician and were highly educated, the whole idea that nobody but a Gentile could be highly educated is frankly anti-Semitic in its origin. Of course, there were very highly educated very highly educated Jews. Philo of Alexandria. We could name Flavius Josephus. We could name many, many, many more. Okay. But the other interesting thing we read here is it says Luke, who was born at Antioch. Now, let's assume that Eusebius, writing 400 years later, or 300 some odd years later, approximately 300 years later actually, that Eusebius's information about Luke is bona fide. Okay, realize how long 300 years is. The time I'm making this video, it is 2023, and so 300 years ago would have been 1723, before some 50 years or more before the American Revolution. How certain would my personal knowledge be as to even George Washington's birthplace? Now, we probably have historical record of that, but the question is, did Eusebius actually have reliable historical record? But let's assume that he did. Let's assume that Luke was born at Antioch. So if Luke was born at Antioch, where is Antioch? Antioch was the capital of Syria. By the way, being born at Antioch didn't negate the idea that he was a Jew. Philo of Alexandria was born in Alexandria, Egypt, and he was Jewish by birth. So there's no reason to believe that Luke wasn't Jewish by birth, either because he was a physician or because he was born in Antioch. But even if he wasn't Jewish by birth, it's clear that he was at least a proselyte, because he wrote 2 books of Scripture, Luke and Acts, and Paul says in Romans chapter 3 that the oracles of God have been committed to the Jews. Okay. So Eusebius' Ecclesiastical History, Book 3, Chapter 4, says he was born at Antioch. Antioch was the capital of Syria. And Syria, the language of Syria, although there were Greek speakers in Antioch, but the language of Syria was Aramaic. In fact, the ancient Romans called Aramaic Syriacos, or as we would say, Syriac, which we use as a term today for a specific dialect of Aramaic. But nonetheless, to the Romans, the word Syriacos just meant Aramaic in general. And they called Aramaic in general Syriacos because it was the language of Syria. And so Luke was born in Syria. So Luke's native language would have been Aramaic and also possibly Hebrew by virtue of his Jewishness, not Greek. Now let's turn to our next handout. Who was Theophilus? In his Antiquities of the Jews, Flavius Josephus references a high priest of his time period that was named Theophilus. He was high priest from 37 BCE to 41 BCE. It was Theophilus ben Ananias, according to Antiquities, Book 18, Chapter 5, Section 3, who was one of the wealthiest and most influential he was from one of the wealthiest and most influential families, Jewish families in Judea at the time, as we can see in Antiquities, Book 19, Chapter 6, Verse 2. this Theophilus was not only the son of Ananias that we read about in Luke chapter 3, verse 2, he was also the brother-in-law of Caiaphas. If you turn to the next page in your handout, I have actually the full quote of Antiquities of the Jews, book 18, chapter 5, section 3. And we're not going to read this whole thing, but you're free to read it because it's a whole lot of unrelated history. But I put in boldface italics the portion that says, within which time he deprived Jonathan of the high priesthood and gave it to his brother Theophilus. That's where Theophilus became high priest. And then the next page has the quote from Antiquities, book 19, chapter 6, verse 2, where it says, he removed Theophilus. I have this also boldface italics. He removed Theophilus, the son of Ananias, from the high priesthood. So when Luke, in Luke chapter 1, verse 4, refers to, verse 3, he addresses the subject to whom he is writing as most excellent Theophilus. Most excellent Theophilus, meaning that whoever he's writing to, this Theophilus, holds some very high position. And then in Acts chapter 1, verse 1, he again addresses his book to Theophilus. Now, there's a lot of reasons also for believing that he was addressing the high priest Theophilus. First of all, most excellent Theophilus is some kind of a high title, and Theophilus that would be very fitting for Theophilus the high priest, who was a high priest in the right time period. So Luke begins his gospel with an account of the righteous priest Zechariah and his vision of an angel in the temple. He quickly moves on to Miriam's purification and Yeshua's dedication at the temple, and then to Yeshua teaching in the temple at the age of 12. Young Theophilus might well have witnessed this because his father was high priest at the time. Theophilus grew up in the temple. Also, Luke makes no mention of Caiaphas and his role in Yeshua's crucifixion, who was Theophilus' brother-in-law. It's almost like maybe he's soft-selling the point to Theophilus, or not bringing up that point. And then in Acts, he makes sure to record the meeting of Ananias the high priest and Caiaphas and Yochanan and Alexander, as many were kindred of the high priest, in Acts chapter 4, verse 6, which Kepha spoke. The kindred of Ananias and Caiaphas would certainly have included Caiaphas' son, brother-in-law, to Ananias' son, and Caiaphas' brother-in-law, Theophilus. So Theophilus would almost certainly have actually taken part in that meeting. Also, the priests and the high priests were almost exclusively Sadducees, and Luke Acts seems to be addressed at Sadducees. Luke especially emphasizes the literal physical resurrection with the account of doubting Thomas in Luke 24:39, where Thomas actually touches the physical resurrected body. The account of Lazarus and the rich man on the afterlife in Luke chapter 16, verses 19 through 31, again seems to drive home the point when Sadducees rejected the afterlife. And also in Luke begins with the account of Zacharias' vision of an angel in the temple, and Yeshua being comforted by an angel. And elsewhere we read and we learn that the Sadducees rejected the idea of angels. So it seems that Luke was a Jew. either a proselyte Jew or a born Jew, but he was not a Gentile. There's no basis for the idea that he was a Gentile at all. Luke was, at least historically, according to Eusebius, born in Antioch, born in Syria, where the native language was Aramaic or Syriacos. And so it would have been expected that Luke would probably write in Hebrew or Aramaic, especially when we take into account that Luke was writing to Theophilus, the high priest. So what would Luke have written to Theophilus in? What if he wrote a letter to the high priest? And Aramaic was his native language of the place in which he was born, Syriacos, if you will. And he also would have known Hebrew as a Jew. Why would he not write to Theophilus? It seems very reasonable that he would write to Theophilus in Hebrew or Aramaic. And of course, Charles Cutler Tory, as we said, makes the point that the Greek text of Luke, more than any other of the Greek text of the four Gospels, the Greek text of Luke has the greatest, most obvious, plainest and constant evidence of being a translation from a Semitic language into Greek. So, yes, absolutely, Luke would have been written in Hebrew and Aramaic, not Greek. And the idea that Luke had to have been written in Greek because Luke must have been a Gentile because he was a physician and therefore an educated man and therefore couldn't possibly be Jewish if he was an educated man, and therefore would have written in Greek, is frankly anti-Semitic and falls on its face when we look at the facts that Luke was A, Jewish, B, born in Syria where the language was Aramaic, and wrote to the high priest Theophilus in certainly either Hebrew or Aramaic. All right, in closing, I want to remind everybody to please donate to support this work. You can donate by clicking on the donate link in the video description, and or by sending donations by PayPal to donations@wnae.org. Also, don't forget to like this video. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Click that notification bell so you'll find out when new videos come out. And let us know what you think in the comments. Participate in the discussions in the comments. Share these videos with your friends on social media. Share us on Facebook. Share us on your Twitter account. And let other people know about these videos. Until next time, shalom.